Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the 2025 NHL Entry Draft. I wouldn't usually make a video like this mid-season. Instead, I would wait until the end of the year for the draft lottery to actually decide where the Sharks are to be picking, and then discuss who might still be available at that spot. But the reason for this is that in previous seasons, it was incredibly obvious who would be the first overall pick. Last season with Macklin Celebrini, and the year before that with Connor Bedard. And so a video like this would basically just be me saying, yeah, the Sharks should take Celebrini, but so should all 31 other NHL teams, and so if they don't get the first pick, it's not going to happen, and you have to go back to the drawing board. But this time around, there is a lot more intrigue at the top of the draft. Maybe things have become slightly clearer over this last month, but I would still say that ultimately it is a toss-up who ends up being that first overall pick. What we can say, however, is that it does seem as though things have narrowed themselves down to these top 4 players. It is this group of guys, a line, and then the rest of the draft class. It is not impossible that over the next few months, somebody could break into this top group, Anton Frondel or a Victor Eklund, but at this point, the race for the first overall pick seems to be just coming down to these 4 players. So I will go through them and discuss who I believe the Sharks should take with their first round pick. And we start off at the top here with James Hagens. If you had asked people 6 months ago, a year ago, who they believed to be the 2025 first overall pick, the vast majority of them would have likely said James Hagens, and for good reason. He was incredible with the U.S. National Development Program, dominant at the under-18s, and he was being set up for immense success this season by joining the Boston College Eagles in the NCAA, filling in the vacancy left by Sharks prospect Will Smith, and joining that top line with Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard, 2 of the best players in college hockey this season. This was an opportunity to truly have an offensive explosion year and really assert himself as that obvious, clear-cut number 1 selection. And while he has been good this season, he hasn't really been that great. You take a look at the numbers here, it obviously should be said the NCAA, a very different game from what gets played at the OHL, so it is expected that his numbers actually points-wise, numbers-wise, are a good bit lower than anybody else on this board, but relative to the rest of the competition in the NCAA, he still hasn't been that amazing. 27 games played, 7 goals, 22 assists, 29 points. That is a 1.07 point per game pace. That ties him for 27th in the entire NCAA. It's not terrible, but it's also not all that great either. For comparison's sake, last year's first overall pick, as we know, for the Sharks was Macklin Celebrini. He also played his freshman year in the NCAA. He would end up at the end of the season 2nd in terms of points per game, only behind Will Smith. And he would ultimately end up winning the Hobey Baker Award for college hockey's best player of the year. James Hagens is not even an early nominee for that award this season. So the gap is quite substantial, which has some people sort of questioning whether or not he truly has that high-end capability. Other aspects that are influencing that, well, his World Juniors performance again was good but not great, overshadowed by players like Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard, of course, but also players on the back end like Ziv Buyem and Cole Hudson. Hagens was maybe only the 5th or 6th best player on that American team. Another thing, and this is very recent, just yesterday was the Beanpot final in the NCAA between longtime rivals Boston University and Boston College. We know of the friendly rivalry between Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini on the San Jose Sharks. Well, in that game, of course, Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard were on that Boston College top line. They were not being centered by James Hagens. However, he was instead on the second line for the Boston College Eagles. And while this would not really be a notable thing to bring up in any random NCAA regular season game, for one as important as the Beanpot final, it is quite telling that Hagens is not in that usual position. And so, while there is still a ton of talent here for this player, he has incredible playmaking ability, really smart, underrated defensive game as well, high-end talent. People are wondering indeed if he does have that first line center capability, or if he might still just cap out as more of a second line high end center, sort of reminiscent honestly of Shane Wright back in 2022. Not necessarily in the types of players that they are, but Shane Wright was seemingly the front-runner choice for the first overall pick in 2022, but his draft year was good, but not all that great. And so when the draft did roll around, it was a surprise when Slavkovsky ended up being that first choice, and it was even more of a surprise when Shane Wright would drop not second, not to third, but to fourth overall pick for the Seattle Kraken when he was expected to be that obvious first choice. Something similar could theoretically happen here for Hagens. He is still expected at this point to be like at least a second overall pick, but you never know what could end up transpiring over the rest of this season. Next on this list, we do have Porter Martone, and there is a lot to like about this prospect for sure. His goal-scoring ability, his playmaking, his hands, he is very good in tight as well. This is a aspect that teams really are looking for because, especially at the NHL level, the vast majority of goals are scored within about 15 feet of the net. This is where Porter Martone finds a lot of his success. He is also kind of that power forward build that teams absolutely love to be able to find in the draft, but there are also some more so negative aspects of his game too. In terms of sort of NHL readiness, you take a look at someone like Hagens or the other players on this board. I won't say that they will make the transition to the NHL next season. That is very, very tough to pull off, but it is certainly a possibility. Comparing that to Porter Martone, it is very likely he would have to head back to the OHL. There is still some work to do here. His defensive game isn't great, his skating isn't amazing, and his just general consistent effort level on a game-to-game basis isn't always quite there. But what really kind of keeps him in this top four conversation and really makes him maybe somewhat of a wild card as well is his player comparisons. People look at Porter Martone and they say he has very much a sort of Corey Perry or Matthew Tkachuk vibe. And we as Sharks fans, especially when it comes to Corey Perry, very familiar with the type of player that he is. Always extremely frustrating when the Sharks had to go up against the Anaheim Ducks with Perry leading the way. Not only was he an incredible offensive talent who has a former Hart Trophy winner actually, but he was also so great at getting under players' skins. He would run goaltenders, he'd cross-check guys in the back, really kind of a pest on the ice that Sharks fans hated, but Anaheim Ducks fans loved. And a more modern example of that being Matthew Tkachuk. You're constantly sort of left scratching your head of these types of antics that Matthew Tkachuk is trying to do on the ice and is sometimes getting away with it, but there is absolutely no denying the talent level that is there and the fact that he was such a key piece for the Panthers in getting them to the Stanley Cup Finals 2 years ago and winning them the Stanley Cup just last season. The ability to pick up a player like that in the draft who has the offensive high-end ceiling, but also the ability to be that pest who really gets under other teams' skins isn't a really attractive choice for any NHL general manager. And just as we look back on the 2016 draft with Matthew Tkachuk and say, even though he was drafted 6th overall, he probably would go at the very least second in a redraft behind Austin Matthews, it is possible that wherever Martone ends up being, we might look back on it in 5 years' time and say he probably could have gone higher because the ceiling is there and the type of player that he is makes him really interesting of a choice. Now, one other thing to be noted here is his World Juniors performance. He was there, but he was on Team Canada instead of Team USA like James Hagens. And the problem, of course, as everyone is completely familiar with, is that Team Canada was a dysfunctional mess at the World Juniors. So Martone being there was kind of like this 13th forward in and out of the lineup, didn't really have a great performance at that tournament, but most players did not. And I don't think this really hurts his draft profile, but obviously it doesn't really help at all either. Next, we move on to Michael Misa, who is kind of like a fan favorite. It does seem, not just amongst Sharks fans who very much are pushing for a Michael Misa draft selection, potentially at least at forward, but also amongst most other NHL fans, constantly talking about Michael Misa this and Michael Misa that, and it's incredibly obvious to see why that is. The numbers that he is putting up this season, very eye-popping, very eye-catching as well. 47 games played, 44 goals, that is almost like goal per game, 55 assists for 99 points. That is a point per game output of 2.11. That leads all players in the OHL by a significant margin. In the case of Martone, who was at 26 goals, 50 assists, that is 1.9. Martone is second. So that is a 0.21 difference in terms of that statistic. This is just showing the level of dominance that Michael Misa has had in the OHL this season. And Michael Misa kind of gives like a Macklin Celebrini-esque vibe as a type of prospect, because while most prospects will have certain areas that they excel in and then maybe some areas that need some work, Misa is kind of a jack of all trades. He does everything very, very well. He's a great scorer, he's a great passer, very smart about the game, works well along the boards, good skating, solid two-way. He's relied on heavily on the power play to be a play driver there, but also plays a ton of time on the penalty kill as well. This is a player who can play in all three zones and excel in each of those positions. Now you might be wondering, well, if there is a Macklin Celebrini comp here, why isn't he expected to be the first overall pick like Celebrini was? Well, the major difference is this, that Celebrini, he was so good in every area, but there were certain aspects as well that he was incredible in, that he was elite, that he was a true game breaker at. His skating ability, his edge work, fantastic, but also just generally his compete level, some of the highest that we have ever seen from any draft player, at least as of late. This is maybe me being a biased Sharks fan, but watching the type of compete that Celebrini has on a game-to-game basis, it is unmatched, or very closely unmatched, by most draft caliber talents, especially as an 18-year-old. When it comes to Michael Misa, there is a question mark of whether or not any of these aspects of his game he is truly going to end up excelling in, because to separate yourself in the NHL from just being a very good everyday player to being that superstar talent, you need to have certain parts of your game that you're just so much better than everybody else at. You take a look at Connor McDavid, his speed and his ability to process the game at that speed is what makes him the best player in the game. Austin Matthews, his immense goal-scoring talent is what got him to that 69 goal total just last season. Alexander Barkov, what helps the Florida Panthers win the Stanley Cup this past season is his elite defensive game. Where is that aspect for Michael Misa that he is so much better than his peers at? That is the question mark amongst scouts. If you can find that aspect of his game, Misa would be an extremely attractive option in this draft. It's just about if you would spot that. Now, I should note that Misa was not at the World Juniors. In fact, the only player out of these four who did not make an appearance there, but this actually in a way works in favor of Misa, because you don't look at this snub and say it, oh wow, this is truly an indication that Misa is not valued, because there were so many snubs, because Misa is Canadian, there were so many snubs by this dysfunctional Team Canada team this year, and because most players for Team Canada played so horribly, Misa not going to that tournament allowed him to just continue chugging along here in the OHL and continue putting up these incredible point totals. I will say this as a final point on Misa: if the San Jose Sharks did need to pick a forward, if their actual top choice was not available and a forward needed to be there, I would be taking Misa over both Hagens and Martone. He would be my guy for sure. But he's not my number one, and I have been stuck on this player for months now, and that has not changed, and it is very unlikely to change over the next few months as we lead up to the draft. My number one is the only defenseman in this top group, Matthew Schaefer, and the big reason here is that as San Jose Sharks fans, we have been incredibly spoiled for many, many seasons with top flight number one defenseman who can act as that offensive play driver, that fourth forward on the ice. Whether that is Erik Karlsson, or prior to that Brent Burns, or prior to that Dan Boyle, it was something that maybe we have become almost taking for granted, but has given us a wake-up call over these last couple of seasons when the Sharks have not had this type of player. This year there was Jake Wallman, who has done an okay job of filling in, but the previous season there was absolutely nobody, and we saw just how much the Sharks struggled to generate any sort of offense whatsoever, and how much pressure this puts on the forward group for San Jose when you don't have that number one guy who can drive a power play and just make so much happen from the blue line like the Sharks have had for many years in the past. Right now, if you take a look at the Sharks' makeup group for their prospects, you have that clear-cut number one center with Macklin Celebrini, the obvious number one goaltender of the future with Yaroslav Askarov, but the defensive group leaves a lot to be desired. Right now, the obvious front-runner here is Sam Dickinson, but there's nobody else who quite has that top-line talent in the system, who has that ceiling to become a top-pairing defenseman. And even when it comes to Dickinson, ignoring the World Juniors performance that wasn't great with, again, the dysfunctional Team Canada that cannot be understated. But even at the time that Sam Dickinson was drafted, scouts were questioning whether or not he truly had that number one ceiling. Sure, he could be a solid second pairing defenseman, almost assuredly, maybe even a top pairing, but could he be that true number one? It was a question mark, and depending all of this Sharks rebuild on Sam Dickinson becoming that player is very risky, and there's a lot of pressure to be putting on Dickinson's shoulder. But if you have a player like Matthew Schaefer who does pan out as that number one, it relieves a lot of that pressure and really helps elevate this rebuild that is already going very well for the Sharks to that next level. Matthew Schaefer has so much talent, kind of like with Michael Misa, does everything very, very well. A great skater who is willing to join up on the rush, but is also able to get back if necessary. He can drive a power play. He skates well along the blue line, moves laterally exceptionally well to open up those shooting lanes, can dish the puck out as good as anybody who you have seen as an offensive defenseman, but he also doesn't slack in his own zone. He's got the size to be able to assert himself in that area. He plays big minutes on the penalty kill. There is a ton to love about Matthew Schaefer, but the two things that really end up putting him over the top, I would say, first of all, is that size that I mentioned. He is 6'2", which is quite good to see, especially from a Mike Grier perspective. One of the main reasons it so seems that he decided to pick up Sam Dickinson over Zeev Buium at last year's draft was that Buium is a more average size 6 foot, while Sam Dickinson is a more physically imposing 6'3". Schaefer being 6'2" means that he's not just this like smaller, shifty 5'9", 5'10" defenseman who you're hoping can find success in the NHL, but more of a 6'2" defenseman who you know will be able to find that success and will not be pushed around and will be able to really carve out his own spot in an NHL lineup. But the other reason is actually Matthew Schaefer's age, because the way things work at the NHL level in the draft is that if you are born after a cutoff date in the middle part of September, you are in the 2026 draft, and if you are born before that, you are in the 2025 draft. So to give an example of a Sharks player currently on the roster, William Eklund, his birthday is in October, and so in his draft year of 2021, he was actually one of the older players. By the time that next season started in 21-22, Eklund had basically been turning, or was about to turn, or maybe he had turned 19 years of age. Schaefer's birthday is in early September. This is just a few days before that cutoff point, and so he is actually one of the youngest players in the entire draft. This is notable because, you know, the difference between a 27 and a 28-year-old, it's not particularly like anything there, but the difference between a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, it can be pretty massive. The month-to-month development in a player, not just based on their game, but also just physically as a person, can be a really large gap. So someone like Schaefer already becoming the best defenseman in this draft and potentially the best player as well, while still being 17 years of age, is insanely impressive and speaks to the ceiling that exists for this player. When the draft does roll around and someone takes him at whatever position he ends up going in, he will be 17 years old still, and through the offseason, still 17. It'll only be a couple of weeks before training camp opens up that he will finally turn 18. The sky's the limit for this particular player, which is why, along with the fact that the Sharks really actively need a number one defenseman in their system, he should absolutely be that slam dunk selection for the Sharks. I really don't think Mike Grier should hesitate if the opportunity does present itself to take him with their first round pick. But that brings us to then the second part of this video. Matthew Schaefer, can the Sharks get him if they don't have that first overall? Because obviously you win the draft lottery, you get the first pick, you can take whoever you want. But we obviously do have to consider the situation where the Sharks don't end up winning the draft lottery. Remember, while a last place finish does give you the best possible odds against any individual team in the NHL, against the collective of the rest of the group, you actually are at a disadvantage. Only a 25.5% chance to pick first, meaning 3 of every 4 lotteries that get ran, you're not going to get that first pick. So we have to consider the situation where that does not happen. And there is sort of some bad news here, which is, and I mentioned this when I mentioned that things were getting a little bit clearer over the last month, Recently, a few weeks ago, the NHL released their central scouting report. They had Matthew Schaefer as the #1 North American skater, and then maybe more so, we had Bob McKenzie, a very well-respected person in the scouting world. He released his draft rankings, having Matthew Schaefer at #1 as well, and he polled 10 NHL scouts. All 10 of them had Matthew Schaefer with that first pick, and 7 of those 10 said that it wasn't a particularly close race either. So that would indicate seemingly that the Sharks really need to be able to get that first overall if they want to pick up this player. But there is some good news still. The first part of it is kind of a cynical view, which is that Matthew Schaefer is currently injured. He got injured during the World Juniors tournament with Team Canada. Prior to that, he had actually been Team Canada's best player on the ice, but he left with a broken collarbone after running straight into the post, which has kept him out since then and is likely to keep him out for at least another month and a half. He might not play another game in the OHL regular season, and then depending on how his team, the Erie Otters, actually do in the playoffs this year, he might not play another game this season in general. If they get bounced in the first round, there's not really much of an opportunity for him to get back into the lineup. And so while this might not hurt his draft stock significantly, it's also obviously not going to be an opportunity for him to raise his draft stock. The other players here, Hagens, Martone, and especially Misa, will have had this last month and will have the next couple of months to continue to try and get back into that first overall conversation. And the reason I sort of specify Michael Misa, we have seen over these last 5 games with the addition of Sharks prospect Igor Chernyshov to that Saginaw Spirit team, Misa has further increased his offensive production 15 points in his last 5 games, truly trying to make a run to be that first overall pick. The other bit of good news here is that currently the next best odds for having that first overall pick outside of the Sharks is the Chicago Blackhawks. And the thing is that if you take a look at the Blackhawks system, one could see that they would be much more likely to go for a forward instead of a defenseman. Obviously, if Schaefer is by far the best player available, nobody wants to be the team that passes on the potential superstar, just as was the case with Celebrini last year. Even if a team had 10 elite centermen, they would have taken an 11th by drafting Celebrini. So I don't see a world in which the Blackhawks pass on Schaefer if it is such an obvious choice. But if there is even somewhat of a conversation to be had, the Blackhawks, one would think, would lean towards taking a forward in that spot. Why is that? Well, unlike the Sharks, the Blackhawks have actually built out their rebuild from the back end. They have their last year second overall pick, Artem Levshunov. They have their 10th overall pick from 2022 with Kevin Korchinski. They have Sam Rinzel, who has been incredibly good in the NCAA this season. And of course, they have Alex Vlasic, who has already established himself as a really solid young defenseman with a really bad Chicago Blackhawks team. In 3 years' time, the Blackhawks top 4 could look like Levshunov, Vlasic, Rinzel, Korchinski, which if Levshunov pans out as the #1 defenseman they were hoping to get when they drafted him last season, that would be a really solid top 4. Sure, you could add Matthew Schaefer to that, and it would improve it. There's no doubt about that. It's kind of like back in 18-19 when the Sharks made the Erik Karlsson trade and added him to a group that already featured Brent Burns. It was a move that made the Sharks better. There's no arguing that. But obviously, you're not going to extract the same type of value just adding a good player to an already good group than, let's say, if the Sharks had actually managed to sign John Tavares in the offseason of that year as a free agent. That was the type of move that really would have put the Sharks over the top. Erik Karlsson didn't add a ton to the Sharks team. That's kind of like what would happen here with Schaefer. On the forward side of things for Chicago, they have Connor Bedard leading the way, the clear-cut #1 main guy for them, but after that, there's not a ton of help on the way. They've got guys like Nazar and Moore and Boisvert, but none of them really seem to have that top-line potential. It is certainly possible that they will play these guys with Connor Bedard anyway, and Bedard has the skill level to actually be able to elevate those guys to look like top-line players. It's reminiscent of what the Edmonton Oilers were doing back in the beginning of Connor McDavid's career. They weren't really giving him the best of the best wingers to work with, but since McDavid was just that good, he could make them 30 goal scorers anyway. But what has really unlocked McDavid's potential, and as such the Oilers' potential, is placing him with actually really strong talent. Bedard You want to be able to do the same thing with that if you are Chicago. And so the ability to draft a Michael Misa and either have him be the center for Bedard on the wing, get him away from some of the tougher defensive matchups and the face-off dot, or to have Bedard center Misa, or to pick up Martone, or to have Hagens run a 1-2 center punch where worst case scenario, like the Oilers do with McDavid and Draisaitl, you play the two of them together on a top line. Something like that would be a very, very good approach for Blackhawks general manager Kyle Davidson to actually take. Again, if Schaefer is clearly the best choice, they will grab him. But if there is a conversation here, I would not be surprised to see Chicago instead opt to grab a forward with that first overall pick. Now, I won't go through every single other team here. As we know, it is not just the Sharks and the Blackhawks in the running for first overall. If we go back to 2023, it was the third last place team, ironically Chicago, who would grab the first overall pick. So that would be like Nashville this season. I won't go through every single team and what they would decide to do, but it should be noted that it is not just Chicago who might end up passing on Schaefer. Look at the Buffalo Sabres, for instance. They already have Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power, two former first overall pick left-handed defensemen. Adding Schaefer to that group doesn't make a ton of sense. You take a look at the Philadelphia Flyers. They are desperately looking for a future first-line center to play with Matvei Mishkov, so they might decide to go for a forward. So basically the point being is that not all is lost if the Sharks do not end up getting that first overall selection. One other point that I do want to mention here, kind of as like a consolation prize at this point, is that the Sharks, at the moment, they are dead last in the league as is known. They are actually now 4 points behind the Chicago Blackhawks for that 31st spot, and then 8 points behind the Nashville Predators for 30th. At that moment now, unless the Sharks are to go on some crazy winning streak to end the season, which is incredibly unlikely, they will probably end up being either first or second last. And as we know, in the draft lottery, you can only ever drop 2 spots maximum. And so if they finish last, they'll only be worst case scenario picking third. And if they finish second last, worst case scenario, they pick fourth. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are 4 players who are most notably available in this draft. So unless, again, the Sharks have a crazy winning streak to end the season, more likely than not, they will end up with still a pretty good player here available in this draft. This is not the same type of situation as last season where it was essentially a Macklin, Celebrini, or bust mode. And so when you're watching that draft lottery and you're seeing Bill Daly about to flip over that first card to who has the first overall pick, and you're crossing your fingers and you're crossing your toes that they'll have the Sharks logo on it so that they could end up grabbing Celebrini. Yes, the Sharks, I do think Matthew Schaefer is the obvious choice. I do think that would be the best thing to really amplify this rebuild. But if the Sharks get second overall, is it the end of the world if they take Misa? If the Sharks drop to even third or perhaps fourth overall and grab a Martone or a Hagens, are the Sharks doomed here moving into the future? Not exactly. So realistically, I think the Sharks have found themselves in a pretty good spot. But again, to really drive the point home, Matthew Schaefer, definitely their prime choice. Class dismissed.